Red Cave Podcast. Reading tonight from Tales from the Cracks, numbers 42 through 44. Starting with Hardly Working, followed by Kill All of Your Darlings, and concluded with The Collector. Looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. William Ernest Henley. Hardly Working. I hate the dreams more than anything. I black out and a few minutes later I wake up rejuvenated, but a little confused. People seem to crowd over you when you're a narcoleptic, and they ask if you're okay. Of course, it's only sleep after all. But there has to be something wrong with you, right? To be wide awake one moment and asleep the next is not of the ordinary. I tend to agree with that fact, even after all the precautions I take. The key is in avoiding triggers. There is always a trigger. Some people pass out in moments of happiness or excitement. I tend to pass out whenever I'm completely surprised or startled. Once I even collapsed at my own surprise birthday party at work. In their defense, I had only worked there for 2 weeks and they couldn't have known. But imagine their surprise. I try not to. So even if I don't know when it will strike, I can stray from stressful environments, like racetracks or amusement parks to name a few. But I rarely ever black out anymore. My life has become one of routine, and I'm fine with that. Sure, I can't go skydiving, but that isn't so much of a loss. I'm fine with taking my lunch breaks inside a cool and familiar park instead of some new place, some uncharted territory. It isn't such a scary disorder if you really look at it. It makes a lot of ordinary tasks a hazard, like driving for instance, but it's just sleep after all. The dreams are the real disadvantage. You see, my dreams always pick up from where I last left off. So, for example, if I pass out in my desk at work, my dream would kick in right away. In that dream, I would be typing away at my computer as if nothing had changed at all, and then something strange would happen. Let's say a clown would pop into my cubicle, juggling chainsaws and whistling. You can imagine my shock. This is supposed to be reality, and suddenly I'm part of my own private circus. Then maybe the clown switches on one of his chainsaws, and I am now in grave danger. Can you tell I hate clowns? Anyway, I wake up at my desk perfectly okay, but these dreams are traumatizing. When reality and fantasy blur, there's no telling what's real or not, and that's scary. Yes, I'm perfectly fine with taking my lunches in the park, thank you very much. It was close to noon when the cop sat down on the bench and wiped his brow. Was it getting hotter? He couldn't help but think of global warming in moments like these, where the sun was nothing more than a giant heat lamp burning into his dark uniform. Why had the force chosen black police uniforms, especially in the summer when they would be made to patrol the streets? He wouldn't be outside at all if it wasn't for the broken air conditioner in his cruiser. It was better to be fully exposed to the sun than be trapped inside that oven, losing 10 pounds solely through his sweat glands. He looked around the park. He was alone except for some joggers and 2 young kids with their skateboards. He shaded his eyes from the harsh glare. Maybe there was a sheltered bench farther down the trail he could rest on. He hitched up his pants as he stood up, but something pulled him back into a sitting position. His belt was caught on his seat, possibly on a nail. The kids were staring at him from across the way, whispering and pointing. He gave them a smug look, and they started to laugh. Without another thought, he tore out of the bench and hiked along the paved trail, scouting out a new place to sit. There was a perfect spot, just under the cover of a tree, but a guy was already there, chewing on a sandwich and staring off into space. He was just about to turn around and trek back to his cruiser when the man looked at him. They made eye contact and the cop stepped forward. "Would you mind if I sat next to you?" he asked. "Of course." He made room for the officer. "I appreciate it," he replied. He folded into the bench and it sank considerably. "That's much better. It's a scorcher." "It is hotter than usual," the man replied. The cop sighed and grabbed his knees. "You must have the best seat in the house right here." He inhaled through his nostrils and craned his neck to watch the trees sway. "This is always my bench. I never have to fight for it," the man said. "That must be nice." "So are you just taking a break? Escaping the sun?" "You could say that, working hard or hardly working, right?" the cop said with a laugh. The man heard loud voices over his shoulder and relaxed once he saw it was only a couple of kids playing around on their skateboards. "Thank God this bench was here, or I might have died from heat stroke," the officer said, his eyes closed and his feet stretched out. "I'm happy I could help." The boy popped his board into a sketchy ollie and lost his balance. He went pinwheeling into the grass. His friend laughed and continued up the trail. The boy applied pressure to his skinned elbow, forcing back tears of pain. His world was already starting to swim, but he managed to keep his composure. "Come on, sluggo," his friend cried from the top of the hill. "Wait up," he yelled back, scrambling to regain his footing. When he turned to find his skateboard, he found something different instead. There was a gun lying in the grass, only inches from his outsplayed fingers. At first, he didn't know what to do. He stared at his own warped and inverted reflection inside the plated chrome. His eyes were wide. "What are you doing?" his friend asked. He was on the hill, making his way back down. The boy ignored the question and crawled under the bench to touch the gun. It was so cool under his fingers, regardless of the heat. He weighed the treasure in his hands. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever found. He'd seen guns on TV, and both the good and bad guys used them. They always pulled back the hammer, aimed the gun, and said some kind of clever tagline like, "Your time is up," before firing. "What are you looking at?" Friend asked, this time much closer. The boy jumped and knocked his head against the top of the bench. He cried out and rolled out into the sun, the gun held high. "Whoa, where'd you find that?" the friend screamed, reaching for the weapon. The boy pulled it back to his chest. "Are you crazy? Shut up!" he barked. His friend threw his hands over his mouth. His eyes were bugging out of their sockets, and his sneakers were dancing excitedly in the grass. "It must be the cops," the boy explained as he got to his knees. He cradled the handgun in his arms. "What should we do with it?" His friend looked up the trail and spotted the cop on one of the far benches. "I think we should take it," he said matter-of-factly. "Really? Isn't stealing from a cop kind of like the worst thing you could do?" "Not if you don't get caught," his friend replied. "Good enough for me." They both ran into the brush. "Well," the cop said, inspecting his watch, "I guess I should get going." The policeman stood up and hitched up his pants. "You have a great day," the man told him. "And you as well." Then he was gone, disappearing behind a group of trees. The man shrugged and finished his last bite of sandwich. A dollop of strawberry jam spotted his colored shirt, and he hastily rubbed at it. To his dismay, he was only able to make the stain a lot worse. He gave up and licked his fingers. He too checked his watch and figured he should stay a little while longer. The boys discarded their skateboards at the base of a tree, and through the foliage they could see the back of the bench and the cop as he walked away. The man had stayed behind to eat his lunch. "Do you think he noticed it was missing?" the boy asked. "Nah, look how calm he looks. If he knew, he would be running around like an idiot," his friend assured him. The boy laughed and held the gun out for them both to see. "It's so cool," his friend said. "Let me hold it." "No way, I found it. I get to hold it." "Let me shoot it." "What are you gonna shoot at?" "You know, tin cans and stuff, like in the movies." "Hey, stupid, do you see any tin cans?" the boy snapped. "Just let me hold it." "Okay, fine, but don't shoot it," the boy said. He handed the gun over to his friend. The kid held it inches from his nose as if to sniff it, and then he aimed it through the bushes. He closed one of his eyes and lined up the sight with the back of the bench. "What are you doing?" the boy asked. He desperately grabbed for the gun, but his friend pulled away. "I'm just playing," he insisted. He raised the gun so the nose was pointed directly at the man's head. "Say goodnight," he whispered in homage to his favorite television program. "Bang," he said. "Bang!" "Okay, let me try," the boy said, wrestling for the gun. "No, hold on, give me." The gun went off and the man's head dropped. The boy scurried away from the bush, the gun lying dormant between them. Everything was silent. "Look what you did!" the friend cried with a hoarse voice. "You did it!" "Yeah, but you were grabbing for it." "Because you're a jerk. You're the jerk." They both turned back to the gun. "Do you think we hurt anyone?" the boy asked. They both peered through the bushes and gasped at the same time. The man was slouched in his seat, and he wasn't moving. The boy grabbed the pistol with shaking hands. For the second time that day, his world was starting to swim behind his tears. "We should have never taken this." He threw the gun over the top of the bush, and then started to cry. His friend grabbed him by the wrist and pulled him up onto his feet. "We have to go," he screamed. "We killed him! We killed him! Come on, we need to run!" The boy followed his friend through the trees, his skateboard forgotten. The cop heard the shot just as he was entering the parking lot. 4 other people ducked to the ground on his left and right, but he only managed to throw his hands up to his head. Once he was able to collect his thoughts, he instinctively grabbed for the gun on his belt. Nothing was there. He tore at every one of his compartments, and even jammed his hands into his pockets, but without luck. He cursed under his breath and looked around him. The pedestrians were all staring at him with brimming eyes. He took a deep breath and tore open the door to his cruiser. First he thumbed the radio and called for backup, and then he freed the shotgun from its clip. He made sure it was safely loaded before he pumped it once. As he crept from one tree to the next, he went over his current situation with a clear head. Even when panic threatened to overcome him, he remembered how his belt had caught on the bench as he stood up. How could he have been so damn stupid? It just so happened to be one more thing he could blame on global warming. He peered out from behind a tree and held his breath. He could see the shady bench from his position, and the man was lying awkwardly in his seat, his eyes closed and his mouth hanging open. There was a red spot on his chest, bright and huge in the sunlight. He pressed his back flat against the tree. Then he heard some footsteps and he looked up. The kids were sprinting up the trail, headed the opposite way. Sensing they were in trouble, he immediately followed suit, his heart throbbing in his throat and his feet weighing heavy. This could be the end. There was someone out there with his gun. There was a man dead or dying, and there were children in danger, working hard or hardly working, he thought to himself. I can't help but laugh about it now, but there was one instance in the park where I blacked out for no real reason. I don't remember what triggered it. It must have been a loud noise that took me off guard. I don't know. It was the dream that I remembered. That loud noise must have carried into my sleep because I thought I'd been shot. In my dream, I was clutching at my chest, and there was blood spurting out between my fingers. I struggled out of my bench and limped into the parking lot. A policeman was waiting for me there with a heavy shotgun. I called out for help, but he didn't seem to listen. He grinned and shot me again in the stomach. That was when I woke up on the bench, the shade gone and the sun now beating down on my face. I laughed off the dream and glanced at my watch. It was time for me to get back to work. Thank God my fainting spells only last a few minutes or else I'd be unemployed. So I got up and made my way out of the park, fully refreshed. I talk about these dreams like they're nightmares, but I'm starting to realize they are somewhat of a relief. Sometimes I think I'd rather have a bad dream than a good dream. After dreaming that I married a swimsuit model, I feel much worse. I wake up and realize that I do not know a model and probably never will. That's pretty devastating for a guy in the middle of the night. But if I wake up at the end of a dream where I was shot and killed, it's a relief. I know that I'm still alive, and I'm a lot happier for it. I'd take the nightmare over the sex dream any day. You know, I seem to remember walking out of the park that day with a dozen cop cars in the parking lot with their sirens blazing. Do you recall what I said about fantasy and reality blurring together? Yeah, it's something. It's really something. You're just going to have to trust me there. It's time to kill your darlings. Perhaps Roger should have seen something wrong with his friend's practice from the very start. Or after all was said and done, he wondered if he should have ever stuck his nose in the strange habits and rituals that he witnessed in his friend's studio apartment. Certainly he should have sucked up his concern, looked the other way, or asked to have poker night over at his own house instead. That way he wouldn't have to look at the many painting canvases clothed in white sheets that were slowly cluttering up one of his friend's storage closets, then the corner of his bedroom, and then the wall behind the sofa. Roger spent a lot of his time staring off into the corner, hoping that his friend Jeff would follow his gaze and finally take the hint for what it was. But Jeff never let on that he noticed Roger's inquisitive glances into those problematic corners of the room. In fact, he remained smiling and good-spirited every time Roger stopped by, 2 times a month at the most. And he was the same old Jeff every time, offering him a drink and a cigar and declaring the name of the game for the night. Jeff never delved too deeply into Roger's personal life, as if he knew that might discourage any further discussions into his own day-to-day. But every time Roger arrived, there would be another new painting, or more, added to the collections in the corner. Roger even ventured to ask one day how business was. With the clear backup in his living quarters, Roger could only assume that business was slow. But Jeff could only assure his friend that it had never been better, and he was pulling in new clients that needed graphic design work for their companies. As puzzling as this was, and even though he should have been relieved to find his friend doing so well, he couldn't shake his feeling of dread every time he looked past his friend's shoulder and laid eyes on the pristine sheets, hiding their unknown masses, like cadavers laid out on their slabs in the morgue to mask the horror of it all. Finally, Roger had had enough of the runaround and asked him flat out why there were so many unsold, sheeted paintings crowding his space. And this was after perhaps 4 months of holding his tongue. Without looking up from his hand, Jeff sneered. "Oh, those? They aren't for sale. I may do something with them someday, but for now, they're serving their purpose right where they are." "Untouched and under sheets, serving as a fire hazard, you mean?" Roger shot back. Jeff chuckled, but still did not meet his friend's gaze, chewing absently on his overgrown mustache hairs. "I paint a new one every few days or so, always of the same few scenarios. It's important for my old superstitious head." "You can't just leave me hanging there," Roger almost snapped, forgetting his poker cards for the time being. Jeff sighed and finally looked across the table, but his eyes seemed to be gazing past Roger to study the untouched easels in the corner behind him. "Ever since I was a kid, I had it in my mind that if I imagined the worst thing that could happen, it wouldn't happen. Have you ever had one of those dreams, before a big interview or test, where you completely bombed or failed?" Roger nodded but did not say anything more, as not to distract from his friend's story. "I think it's a healthy defense mechanism of the subconscious, where if you live out the worst-case scenario, it's likely to not happen, because you're prepared for it, in a way. It's only the most unexpected events that are the most horrifying. So I've attempted to think up all the worst things that could ever happen, to hedge my bets. I've painted these events, really solidified them in my mind, and knock on wood, none of them have come to pass. Whenever I think one of those scenarios needs a bit of an update, because I've thought of some new terrible detail, I'll repaint it." Roger laughed, but quickly shut his mouth when Jeff did not join him in the levity. "You can't be serious. I would have never taken you to be so hyper-superstitious. How can you think that it's because of the painting that these things didn't happen? Maybe they haven't happened simply because they're unlikely." Jeff creased his forehead in a frown and went back to studying his hand. "I didn't expect you to understand. It's a tried and tested technique that may only work for me. Like I said, ever since I was a child, once I started thinking up the worst-case scenario, they never happened." A pregnant silence followed this, one which was only broken by the clatter of chips, as Jeff raised his bet, but Roger was back to inspecting the room. Why keep them under sheets? Roger questioned. It wasn't the most pressing of all the queries at the tip of his tongue, but he didn't think he could stand the awkward pause any longer. The images are unpleasant. I wouldn't want to subject you to them. I've seen some of your work. You're not afraid to show darkness and pain, and there was never a problem with it before. Let me take a look at one at least. I'm afraid that's out of the question. They're too personal. Roger smirked. What? You're afraid I'll judge you when I see your deepest, darkest fear? It can't be too bad. Don't we all have the same fears for the most part? I think any psychiatrist would have a comparable list to show you. No, I don't think my fears are comparable to yours, Jeff huffed. Are you gonna go or not? Just give me a hint. What's the general theme? Give me a bullet list. Drop it, Raj. You're not getting to see any of it. I shouldn't have even mentioned it. You think I'm gonna drop down dead because I learned your secret? Jeff shrugged wooden shoulders, and Roger could sense that he was struggling with something huge in his mind. Then you'd be doing me a favor, right? Roger pressed good-humoredly. As long as I see these things and visualize them like you do, they'd never happen to me, correct? Jeff shook his head seriously. No, these are special kinds of events. They're things you wouldn't normally think about on your own. They're still possible in my mind, of course. But the likelihood that they would ever happen are slim to none. Only about 0.7% of people experience these things, so you're better off not knowing. You could go your whole life without confronting these traumas. So I would leave it at that. I had a specific set of dreams that forced me to live out the horror of those events. By painting them, I have an intimate connection with them. They mean something, but only to me. I'd hate to think what that would mean if someone else was to look at my diseased mind. Would he have to paint the images as well? What if he glanced at them and didn't take them seriously, like he should? It would be the same as a warning unheeded, and I wouldn't want to be held responsible for that. How does that make any logical sense? All I know is that none of the things I've seen in my dreams have come to pass, and that's a very good thing. And do I think it's because I painted them out? Yes and no. I don't think it's the paintings themselves that are the good luck charm. It's the sheer act of immortalizing the things I've seen. It shows God or whoever is listening that I'm serious about it. And my intention is to avoid going down that road. If that doesn't make sense to you, then I don't know what else to say. And Jeff left it at that. And even with all the questions still plaguing Roger's mind, he had to admit that there was nothing else he could think to say that might sway his friend from his unshakable foundation. There truly wasn't too much more to express, and Roger could almost follow his logic, although he was certain that looking upon the paintings would have no other lasting effect on his life. He didn't know what to expect, but pulling back those sheets and looking upon all the hellish glory of Jeff's acrylic depictions became the sole passion in his life. When they called the game, he was even ready to sacrifice their friendship right then and there, if only to sidestep his friend as he held the door open for him and snag one of those sheets from a canvas on his way out. He had wanted nothing more than to be left alone for 2 minutes in the main room as his friend went to the bathroom. But Jeff seemed to know what was on his friend's mind and made no indication that he was going to leave Roger on his own without his supervision. But Roger had already come up with a solution, and all he had to do was pretend like he was scrolling social media on his phone, reading something nondescript while Jeff was cleaning the table. In actuality, he was on his camera, focusing his viewfinder on Jeff's far window. It wasn't the window itself he was interested in, but the reflection in the glass. So he readjusted himself in accordance with Jeff's ceiling light, so that he was perfectly oriented to catch the reflection without any interfering glare. Jeff had overlooked one of his paintings, as it was free from a protective sheet like the others. It was positioned in the back of the clutter, and it had been flipped around so that Roger could only see the back of the canvas. But it was facing the unshaded window. Maybe the sheet had fallen off the painting. Maybe Jeff had thought it was enough to have it facing away from the center of the room. Roger could just make out a bit of the painting's reflection in the glass. Not enough to study it closely without Roger looking, but he could snap a photo and scrutinize it later, and that's precisely what he did. While Jeff was returning all of the poker chips back to their case, Roger took a series of snapshots and excused himself from Jeff's apartment with the invitation to return next week. He waited until he was safely home in his own apartment, 20 minutes later, to sit down in the dark in his living room couch so that he could blow up the image as far as he could on his phone's screen. It was difficult to make out, and he used all of the touch-up tools in his phone's photo viewer to clean it up and brighten the pixels while also reducing the fuzzy noise. What he saw was difficult to make sense of at first, but he could be sure that it was a lifelike and painstakingly detailed self-portrait of Jeff. Roger would have been impressed with the lifelike reality of the painting if it wasn't for the strange orientation that seemed to leave a lot of empty space at the top of the canvas. He wouldn't think that a professional artist like Jeff would have made such an oversight until he realized that what he thought was empty space was simply the shoulders and neck of a figure. Once he understood what he was looking at, there was no unseeing it, and he could finally be sure that it was indeed a self-portrait of Jeff. but his friend's eyes were blank and his mouth was slack. In his portrait, Jeff was holding his own severed head. There was no denying it, and Roger felt so sick after processing this image that he went straight to bed, allowing his phone to tumble from his hand and bounce underneath his coffee table. And he fell asleep hours later, his mind racing with thoughts of what other horrible scenarios could be preserved on those once blank canvases. He had a hard time even imagining what could be as horrible, or worse, than losing your own head. And he wondered if this knowledge of the worst-case scenario was indeed a curse, as Jeff had tried to warn him. It was a burden for unimaginative people like Roger, who did not have an active imagination or a creative bone in his body. He was not good at devising hypothetical scenarios or thinking up the worst possible alternative as Jeff could. And if Roger wasn't able to imagine the worst possible turn of events by Jeff's logic, then he couldn't possibly prepare himself for the impossible, and it was thus more likely to happen. He even heeded Jeff's warning and flipped to a blank page in one of his New York Times best-selling hardcovers to sketch out a quick reinterpretation of what he saw reflected in Jeff's apartment window. It was more of a stick figure than anything, but it communicated the overall gist of the sentiment. He wondered if it was good enough to ward away the bad omen, and he figured it would have to do. Still, it opened up a wide door of infinite, unimaginable interpretations that all clashed so violently in Roger's mind that they prevented any of their interpretation. He could not think what other unexpected things might plague him in the coming days, and he wanted to call Jeff in that moment there after midnight to demand that he reveal what other events he had immortalized. But he fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion from running his mind ragged with worry, and he dreamed that night of barging into Jeff's studio and ripping the sheets from every canvas he could get his hands on, revealing paralyzing images of giant spiders with legs as tall as the ceiling, fiery combustion of the body, sinkholes opening up and swallowing houses, asteroids falling from the sky, collapsing rooftops, and blackened tornadoes tearing through a neighborhood. But the most terrifying image of all was the self-portrait of the decapitated head in Jeff's arms. And in the dream, Jeff came out of the closet, headless and square-shouldered like the painting, and his head rocked back and forth in the swing of his forearms, his milky eyes roving madly and mouth jeering. He did not sound happy to see Roger, and he hissed at his longtime friend. The voice that escaped his lips mimicked the release from a deflated tire, and all of his words ran together like a sped-up recording, with all the pauses cut out. Only my pure mind was meant to capture and hold such raw terror. Your chaotic mind could only add oxygen to the fire, and now both our lives will burn. And Jeff dropped his own head to the hardwood floor with a window-rattling bang, and Roger burst up from his sheets screaming when the head began to roll his way at an alarming speed, Jeff's teeth gnashing. As soon as he was fully awake, the first thing Roger did, barely registering the early AM hours, was call Jeff on his cell phone, but his friend did not answer. He couldn't help but carry the indescribable dread drummed up from the dream into his waking life, and it was not something that was easy to shake. He rushed to his front door and pulled it open, remembering his shoes and backtracking to the back door so that he could retrieve his slippers there. And when he rounded the back into the kitchen to select his car keys from the ring that he had almost forgotten, he grinded to a halt there on the cold linoleum, his slippers still in his hands, as his front door had just slammed by itself. And it wasn't a gentle close that his door would sometimes do, as his door hinges seemed to be loose enough to cause even the slightest of breezes to catch it. But there was no dramatic wind in the apartment complex hallway outside that should have slammed it with that much force. And were those heavy footsteps now thundering across his hardwood toward the kitchen? Whoever it was would have to pass through the doorway at the far end of the room, separating the living room from the kitchen, to confront Roger where he currently stood, dressed for bed and shoeless. A sick part of him wanted to remain where he was so that he could look at the unnamed horror in the face, as Jeff had done in his own dreams. But he ultimately retreated into his bedroom when he saw the thing's shadow on the wall, growing in length with the intensifying sound of thundering feet, and it shared the same square and empty shoulders as Jeff's self-portrait. Roger shut his door, locked it, and pushed his desk against it as a blockade, just as something as colossal and heavy as a battering ram bounced off the other side. It caused a reverberation that sent Roger sprawling out across his bedroom carpet. There on the ground, he whimpered and curled into a ball as the unstoppable force smashed into the door again and again, and with the side of his face glued to the carpet, he could just glimpse through the gap in the door at the bottom, to glimpse the two sneakered feet standing square in the hallway, and they were indeed Jeff's brand of running shoes. "I'm sorry!" Roger screamed, but this did not alleviate the force of the shoulders, elbows, and arms that beat at the reverse side of the door. "Please! I'm sorry I looked! You gotta believe I would have never—" and something large and round collided with the floor between Jeff's shoes, and it rolled perfectly in place like a bowling ball so that a single staring, bloodshot eye and half of a dripping mouth could be seen through the crack. "It's time to kill all your darlings, Raj." Jeff's voice croaked, without any emphasis, without emotion. It gargled wetly in his throat, and Roger scrambled away, screaming from the door as the blood began to pour in, and the banging did not stop. Not until the lock was broken. The desk was shoved aside against the onslaught of brute force, and the head floated in on the pool of its own blood. But Roger had already fainted in the corner. His fingernails stuck into the wall from his attempt to claw through in his blind terror, and he would not ever wake up. It was only after all the banging had ceased and Roger's last wheezing breath had tapered away into nothing that his phone blew up with a piercing ring from its place on the kitchen floor, and the caller ID on the screen read Jeffrey. The collector. Levitt figured that it was one more experience to chalk up on the growing list of near-fatal occurrences on his chalkboard of life. Then again, was it something he should add to a checklist that also included a close drowning episode at 11, falling down a flight of stairs at 20, and getting in a fatal car accident that took his own adult son's life, where he had only walked away with a few scratches? He had simply gone out of town on holiday during the hurricane, only to return to find that his hometown had been practically leveled, his own trailer a pile of rubble, and a tree resting in the very quarter of the trailer that would have contained his sleeping form if he had been home. And it surely would have, as the storm had struck in the middle of the night, evolving in the AM hours from a Category 2 to a 5 with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. He might have received the warning message on his phone, and he might not have, as it was his common routine to turn off all devices at night before retiring to bed, and the farmhouse that he had been tasked with caretaking since his father's death had disappeared from its field. If his father had not died of cancer 10 years earlier, he certainly would have disappeared with the house, along with the gate and pickup truck. If it wasn't for Levitt's streak of near misses with the Grim Reaper, he might have spent more time ruminating on the strange case of the missing farmhouse. But he was known to make offhand jokes with his chums at the local bar about his unspoken agreement with death. If any of them were to ask him how he felt about the fact that the house was just missing, without a sign of a shingle or a doornail to show that a house had once stood in the field, except for the clear crop of dead grass, of course, he would have said something like, "Ever since I was a child, I turned around and grabbed death by its broken little face and followed it for a change." And that was in fact how he carried himself through his life, stepping into traffic when he liked, and hunting in the woods without care for a safety trigger or an orange vest. The missing house was obviously one more example of a misfire on Death's part. He had hoped to catch Levitt there, as that would have most likely been his sanctuary from the storm if he hadn't left town on a whim to visit a friend in New England. It had been a brick structure after all, and no one in town could understand how that hadn't survived the gusts. Hell, even Levitt's trailer was a pile of rubble, but where was the rest of his late father's place? He didn't care about the manufactured home as much as he did the first edition of his favorite book of poetry, his only prized possession, which had seemingly blown away with the house. It was something that his father had passed down to him, and which had been left inside the house for safekeeping. But the first edition of his Tom Collins book, signed and valued at $975 online last time he checked, was missing. Although it wasn't much of a near-death experience, considering that many more of his bar friends could recount harrowing stories of their nights spent in the bathtub as the wind tore up their front yards and rocked their foundation, he felt that he might have to add this to his chalkboard. Death, the petty collector that he was, had taken his piece, his coin for the ferryman. Every near-death experience was marked by a missing object that he loved. After nearly drowning at age 11, he had returned to the shore to find his bike stolen. After rolling down the Great Hall concrete steps of his university, he would find that his expensive pair of sunglasses had been missing from his dorm room, while his roommate was out of town. And after limping away from the car wreck, the worst part of all, his son had been taken from his life. The book felt like an added kick in the teeth while he was still down, as he hadn't even been there in the tearing wind to offer up his life in exchange. There had never been a Hail Mary moment when his pleas to God were thrown up on deaf ears, to be carried away by that wind while his nails dug into his own flesh, and his teeth ground down to their nubs in his dry mouth. If his life had been spared and he had been allowed to dust himself off, pushing away the debris from his tomb like a heavy stone, he would have gladly given up the book, chalking up just one more loss to the Reaper Man. But it was his conviction that he had been cheated this time around, perhaps as a mistake, that carried him at last into the woods behind his father's land. Perhaps the reaper had thought him home that night, and maybe now that he was back in town and ignorant to the whole turn of events, maybe he could plead his case and find the remnants of his dad's home, and in those ruins maybe he'd find his book. It only seemed fitting, as one of his favorite poems from the book was titled The Janitor's Closet. In the 5-stanza poem, it read simply, "All the forgotten items, mittens on morning buses, coins in community dryers, and baseball caps on hidden bar hooks, could fill a janitor's closet from floor to ceiling, and at the end of my life, I will come to claim that lost and found, if only I knew where I left the ticket." Maybe his father's house had disappeared for a reason, so that he could find it, and once he did, what else would be waiting to claim him? He only had his mind set on his book, so he went out without his orange clothing, even in the height of deer season, and followed the trail of fallen trees through the woods. At first the fallen trees seemed to follow the length of the beaten path his father loved to hike, blocking his way and coming to rest perfectly over the trail. Then they seemed to deviate further from the trail, off the beaten path and into the uncharted lands. It seemed as if he was following the trajectory of the 150-mile-per-hour gust that had tore through the forest. At least, his rational mind would try to tell him that these trees were likely one more casualty of the hurricane. But he wondered if the massive oaks had been taken out by the house itself, on its beeline through the trees as it plowed through on its journey to its next resting place. Hell, weren't 100-mile-per-hour winds practically the same as a tornado? Was it that unlikely that a house couldn't have been picked up Wizard of Oz style and carried off? He figured that it was something to go off of. At least it was better than just meandering carelessly into the woods as he usually did, once again throwing caution to the wind and knowing that he'd find his way out again, as he always had more belongings to trade to the ferryman. If he wanted to trace his way back, all he had to do was follow the aftermath of fallen trees, back to his dad's land. They seemed to have fallen in a perfect kind of breadcrumb trail, every 20th tree or so, as if something had been careful not to go too far before knocking over another log so he'd see it, like a perfect marker. He also couldn't help but notice that the spider webs were all broken along the trajectory he was following, while they held strong with spider guards on all the surrounding trees, as if someone else had blazed this trail ahead of him. He looked out for footprints in the soft soil, but never proved to any degree that anyone had been in these woods for months. Who in their right mind would? Days after a hurricane with plenty of broken trees teetering and threatening to fall, there was no sense in trekking into the scene of such a crime of nature. But death and him had an agreement, he could only reassure himself. His book should be valuable enough to count as payment for 50 more lifetimes, as far as he was concerned. And then he was standing in a clearing again, one eerily similar to his father's, and he did a double take, glaring up at the harsh sunlight, and wondered if he had walked in a complete circle back to where he started. But that wasn't quite right either, although he was becoming more and more convinced that this was indeed his father's land, judging by the front path, rusted gate, and flattened pickup truck with the expired plates. Here was his dad's brick house just as he remembered it, sitting pretty and perfect in the middle of it all. The collector held it in his hands, weighed it respectfully, and then cracked it open oh so gently with his nose inches from the book's spine. He inhaled that satisfying antique musk. He closed his eyes and hugged the heavy cover against his chest. He didn't have much longer with his next great addition to his library. He told himself that this library was an investment, but the recent publications were strictly there to complete his collection. And what he held in his hands was the first edition of Tom Collins' very first book of poetry, Bare Voices. It was a true 7.5 inches wide and 12 inches across in his hands. It was as heavy as a bundle of bricks. The jacket was protected in a cool sheet of mylar plastic, glinting happily in the light. The cover was slightly frayed and discolored at the edges, but other than that, it was in fine condition. The spine was well worn, but never had been cracked or split. He himself had never read Bare Voices, and he thought it only right that the first should be from the copy in his hands. He was too afraid to bend the spine, so that he may comfortably read from the pages in his favorite sitting chair. No, that was too much responsibility for him to bear. He was going to leave it exactly as he found it, for the time being. He set the copy down on the table and ran his hand over the plastic covering. He grinned and carefully pulled up the front cover. He needed to check the title page again. There it was, the copyright sporting the proper year, 1945. Under that was the proclamation of authenticity, so simple yet so potent and grounded. First edition. And below that was the author's signature, made out to a man named Harrison. He shut the book tight and sat across from it at the table. He wanted to read it. He wanted to prop it up on one knee and tear through it, his voice lost in the familiar voice of Tom Collins, until they were intertwined as one. He wanted to feel the ancient type paper between his thumb and forefinger, anticipating his chance to turn it in one conclusive demonstration, but he knew he couldn't. In this way, he waited for the knock on the farmhouse door. There were no signs of forced entry. The gate was still locked tight with a chain, and the weeds growing around were standing stock still, not the least bit trampled. As Levitt stepped over the chain on the gate, he trampled those very weeds into the dirt, for what he was sure was the first time. He found the remnants of the path and followed it up to the shed, which had sunk a few inches since he last saw it, the outer walls bending inward like playing cards. The actual farmhouse was there in all its unmatched beauty. The red paint had long ago peeled off to reveal the smooth underskin, which he knew wouldn't last forever. He dared to creep up onto the path. He approached the door and tried the knob, locked. From inside, he could hear a voice straining to answer to his entry. Without another thought, he knocked smartly. The door opened to reveal a strange gaunt man dressed in a rumpled suit, his long hair and beard slicked back as if wet. He was holding a book in his hands. "What are you doing here?" Levitt cried. "This is my house," the man said matter-of-factly. "This house?" Levitt looked around, as if to make sure he was in the right place. "This was my dad's farmhouse for 31 years. It's been abandoned for almost that long." "I've lived here all my life," the gentleman replied. "I must be losing my mind. So you're saying you've been squatting here for all your life?" The man shook the book at him. "Watch what you say. The house was perfectly good. I took advantage. Why waste a perfectly good house?" His reasoning almost seemed impenetrable. "This is private property, you know," Levitt cried. "I could have you arrested." "Hey, where'd you get that book?" Levitt said, noticing the Tom Collins book of poetry in his hands, titled Bare Voices, for the first time. "I found it in the house," the man said. "Well, this is my father's property, and you can see the dedication on the title page. It's made out to Harrison, my father." "Ah, so you're Harrison's son, then? I suppose that is enough proof, and I'm a fair man. You can come in and claim this book and everything else you've lost. But you know the cost. You've always known the payment." "No, I don't know what you're talking about. Just give me back my property and get the fuck out of my house." Instead of slamming the door in his face, the man stepped back and allowed the doorway to open even more in welcome. But the man did not offer up the book. He only held it closer to his chest like a badge. There was only a single beam of light cast on the floor and wall from one unshaded window near the back of the house, but the rest was largely left dim and dreary. But was that a bike leaning up against the hearth? A blue dyno, as he used to ride to the quarry when he was 11. The bike he had called his own before it was stolen on a fateful day. He knew his dad would have never brought a bike into the house like that, as Levitt had been scorned on several occasions for doing just that. From inside the house, over the gaunt man's shoulder, he heard someone clear his throat, and he saw the profile of someone shift in the dancing dust particles as someone crossed and uncrossed his legs, sitting at a card table in the corner. And the smoke danced around his ears, and he saw the ember of his cigarette spark as the man took another draw. But both of his hands seemed to be spread out in front of him on the table. Only his son ever left a cigarette to dance on his bottom lip like that, hands-free, and Levitt finally recognized his lost pair of aviators sitting on his son's face and felt his heart drop. "Jeremy?" he cried. He stepped across the threshold and heard the door slam behind him, bathing him in darkness. He fumbled forward in the dark just as another crack exploded, but this time outside the house. At first he thought it was the fire of a hunting rifle, but he heard the splintering of a tree and the scratching of branches on the roof before it too cracked and fell down on his head in an avalanche of plaster, shingles, and brick. Levitt sits there in the shadows, the only source of his light coming from the small picture window mounted on the cold door in front of him. He wants to walk around, but he can't. There is a thick blanket around his body, holds his arms up to his chest like he's dead. Is he dead? He didn't know of any person who was buried sitting up on a wall of pillows like that. There was someone outside the little picture window, staring in at him. The gaunt man with the white hair and beard. He doesn't move to open the door. He doesn't do anything but monitor him. And Levitt is sure that is all he will ever do, admiring his newest piece of his collection, preserved behind glass, for his scrutinization. After all, isn't anyone's life ultimately on loan to another? He shifted his weight and felt something sharp dig into his side. He reached behind him blindly and extracted the book tucked into the pillows behind him, and saw that it was his first edition copy of Bare Voices. His eyes filled with tears, and then made contact with those of the gaunt man on the other side of the glass. The man nodded at him, before pulling away to disappear into the murky darkness. As he cracked open the cover, he prayed that his light would not go out, not anytime soon. Tune in next time to Red Cave Podcast, where we will be reading from Tales from the Cracks, numbers 45 through 47. Until then, guard your soul.